Let me ask you this. Could you help me look smarter, more attractive, and better than I really am on a date?
Legally, of course, no one forbids it.
Who is a theologian?
I studied religion from the perspective that it should eventually disappear.
Is it possible to be both an atheist and a theologian?
Well, like Plato or Hegel or Marx or someone else.
There's a trend toward greater secularization. Go to confession with a priest or go to a psychologist or psychotherapist. And now there's also a trend toward artificial intelligence.
Save your money and then simply just go to confession and that's it.
Today on our podcast we have Dmitry Viktorovich Shmonin, Doctor of Philosophy and Director of the Institute of Theology at St. Petersburg State University. Thank you, I'm very glad to see you here today. We are in an amazing place at my alma mater at St. Petersburg State University, not at the Faculty of Management, which I graduated from, but at the Institute of Theology. Tell us a little about where we are sitting, about this wonderful place and what surrounds us.
Good afternoon, Elizaveta. Indeed, the hall is unique. This is the Petrovsky Hall of the historic 12 Collegia building, the main building of St. Petersburg State University. The hall is historic for many reasons, including the fact that the Senate of the Russian Empire once held its sessions here. So it's no surprise, of course, that it was at St. Petersburg State University, one of the two national universities with special status, that the Institute of Theology was founded, opened to be more precise. This happened not so long ago in 2022.
Wow, so the Institute of Theology is only 3 years old?
Yes, but that doesn't mean that theology itself is only 3 years old, or that theology at St. Petersburg State University is only 3 years old. Theology was taught in the 19th century. The basics of catechism were taught in the 18th century, back in the days of Lomonosov, whose bust is installed here in this Petrovsky Hall, the Senate Hall, in memory of the fact that Mikhail Vasilievich was once the rector of the university. Next to us is Emperor Peter I, the founder of St. Petersburg University. St. Petersburg University was originally established as part of the Academy of Sciences by decree of Peter. If we look according to the new style, yes, on February 8, 1724. It is precisely on February 8, according to the new style, that we celebrate the university's birthday. The university on the Neva is already 301 years old. And this corridor of the main building is very impressive in its length. It's actually 440 meters, almost half a kilometer. If you take a close look at the building of the 12 colleges and know its length, then comparing it to the main building of Moscow University, you'll realize that in terms of length, St. Petersburg University is longer than Moscow University is tall. But really, that's probably just a joke about how it's not worth comparing these two universities, just as it's not worth comparing the two cities. Each has its own main feature and its own unique charm.
Actually, I've only been in this building once when I was finishing my bachelor's degree and we received our diplomas here. They gave us caps in the assembly hall. And that was the first and only time I visited the main building of St. Petersburg State University.
Otherwise, nowadays, this place mostly houses the administrative departments of the rectorate, research services, educational offices, and so on. On the third floor, there's a chapel and the premises of the Institute of Theology of St. Petersburg University.
A chapel? I didn't know there was a chapel here.
There's the magnificent Church of the Holy Apostles, Peter and Paul, located here, which was recently and meticulously restored. The beautiful iconostasis was also recently and carefully renovated, and the entire church was solemnly consecrated by His Holiness Patriarch Kirill in September of 2024. This significant event marked a new chapter for the historic and revered church. The Patriarch came here specifically to...
Right here, in this building.
Yes, in this building.
Since I've come back to my hometown with such an interesting mission to find out what theology is, my first question is, who is a theologian?
A theologian is, broadly speaking, someone who is able to understand not only the immediate, everyday questions of life, not just a deep specialist in, say, church history or philosophy, but something more. It's someone who is able to reflect on the most important things, though perhaps not in quite the same way as a philosopher. Because how does a philosopher approach things? He chooses some authority for himself, picks a particular school, Plato or Hegel or Marx or someone else. And so people say, this one is a Marxist, that one is a Hegelian. In other words, you are following a certain current, a current of something human. But here, the main thing is of a higher order. The axiom, the starting point, comes from God. That is, from the perspective of eternity, from the standpoint of the most important meanings, the theologian looks at the world as a philosopher, as a historian, as a philologist, as a cultural scholar, and as a jurist.
All right. So how then does a theologian differ from a religious studies scholar?
Religious studies is a specific academic field. It emerged at a time when, generally speaking, among the sciences about religion, there was still this phrase, scientific atheism during the Soviet era. A science that studied religion from the perspective that it should eventually disappear, it's considered a backward worldview. People, grandmothers and such, who are not very educated and so on and so forth, that's it. But religious studies as an academic field emerged in the post-Soviet period in the early 90s as a healthy alternative to study religion from the perspective of the sociology of religion, philosophy of religion, phenomenology of religion, that is, everything about different religions, but kind of from the outside, like how an ichthyologist studies fish or an ornithologist studies birds.
Is it possible to be an atheist and a theologian?
Legally, of course, no one forbids it. But it's strange. It's like enrolling in a theater institute while being catastrophically untalented, or going to the Academy of Arts, which is right here nearby, without being able to draw at all. That's how I would compare it. But legally, of course, anyone in our country, as a free person, can enroll in a faculty of theology, or an Institute of Theology, or a department of theology.
I graduated from St. Petersburg State University, and during my school years I studied at a Sunday school in the monastery of John of Kronstadt here in Petersburg, on Karpovka. Yes, and I consider myself a believer. Do you think there is currently a trend toward greater secularization, or is there actually some kind of shift among young people in terms of toward faith? For example, nowadays there are many parishes that are very popular among young people. They make merch, produce their own bread, have bakeries and coffee shops, and it all looks really great. But is this more of an isolated case, or is it a widespread trend now?
I hope that there is a certain, I'm saying this very cautiously, there is a certain trend. And secularization, of course, largely defines, you're right, our modern life, and not only for non-believers, but also for those who, because of it, experience some constant stings. Those little stings from life, like mosquito bites. You get bitten here and then here again. But just go and buy yourself some repellent, right? Put it on. There you go. Why not? Why not?
Well, as if it's 100% an extra point of support, especially in unstable times or during difficult periods. And if, for example, a young person doesn't have this support, then as they get older, it's as if living becomes harder.
Yes, and in this particular regard, many people often put themselves into the capable hands of professional psychologists and experienced psychotherapists, individuals who genuinely and truly do provide significant help. That's a well-known fact.
By the way, what do you think about this? Is there, for example, an alternative, going to confession to a priest or going to a psychologist or psychotherapist? What's your opinion on this matter?
I'll answer this in a somewhat half-joking yet entirely pragmatic way. My sincere advice is to save your money and then, most importantly, go to confession.
And what if it doesn't help?
I truly think that it will really help a lot.
Now I notice, for example, that religious teachings often strongly conflict with secular life, so that, let's say, living as a believer and living a normal life as a young woman or man can be hard to combine. Often there's a conflict and you end up standing out either in one place or the other. Is there any kind of life hack to make this life more organic and...
Organic? Well, I think probably you absolutely shouldn't fall into any kind of extreme fanaticism, especially external, outward fanaticism. Christ also strongly reproached the Pharisees and other prominent representatives of official Judaism for constantly putting their outward ritualistic holiness, so to speak, holiness in quotes, their external piety and overt religiosity on prominent display for everyone to see.
They elevate it to an absolute.
They elevate it to an absolute, yes. The point isn't really about how you specifically behave during fasting days, whether you eat meat or only. Everything now is so flexible, so surrounded by all sorts of restrictions and at the same time relaxations that in the end it doesn't really matter. What matters most is your inner attitude. So ultimately what's most important is the worldview that you have. If you believe that God created the world and that as a human you are the main being in this world, that you are made in His image and want to become like Him, and that your life is given to you in order to achieve something higher, then you have much greater prospects than if you simply live thinking about it only twice a year on the most exceptional occasions when something happens.
You know, for many young people nowadays, many say it's one thing to believe and another thing to go to church. They say, for example, I believe but I don't go to church. But overall, I think that if a person believes, that's already good. It's better than nothing. Even if it's hard to go to church, it's still...
You just need to understand what you believe in. As they used to say in the Middle Ages, I believe in order to understand, I understand in order to believe.
What would you advise someone who is searching for answers but isn't religious? In today's world?
Well, probably the most delicate and careful advice one could offer is this. If you choose to engage with certain significant literary works or profound philosophical books, it is essential that you read them with deep attentiveness and thoughtful consideration. Do not, under any circumstances, fall completely under the captivating spell of the author's words, nor should you blindly follow every single author's perspective without critical thought. Instead, it is imperative that you genuinely reflect upon and thoughtfully process everything you read within a book, interpreting and understanding it in your own unique and personal way. If you do this, then sooner or later you will probably come to fully realize that your understanding truly needs a second, serious, not a mere counterbalance, but a profoundly significant and essential addition, namely faith. It's like sitting all the time in a closed room, even if it's very well furnished, with everything you need, wonderful, with a full fridge, a TV with all the channels and every convenience. And they bring you food, they bring you water, they bring you anything you want. But then at one fine moment, you open the window and step out onto the balcony and see the sun, the garden, and the moon at the right time. That's roughly how philosophy relates to theology.
Tell me, before you became a doctor of philosophy, were you a religious or a believing person? In other words, did you come to it through philosophy, or were you raised that way from childhood? How did it happen?
No, not from childhood at all. I was born in Kamchatka in an officer's family, and the political department was just across the street.
I see.
And there couldn't even be any talk of baptism, not at all. And I was baptized as an adult, already a candidate of sciences and an associate professor, while working here at the Church of Macarius of Egypt at the Mining Institute, where I was employed at the time.
So you were baptized when you were a candidate of sciences and you became a doctor after you were already baptized?
Well, yes, you could say that. You could put it that way too, yes, but of course there was no direct connection between being baptized and receiving academic degrees or titles. That was also a kind of transformation. In general, the process of a person's education is a transition. That's right.
So you were developing in your scientific work and at the same time, as I understand it, developing your spiritual side as well.
Well, yes, we would sit and argue in the philosophy department, and at some point I asked myself, how do I actually relate to God? And I realized that I couldn't answer that question until I had taken certain steps internally, within myself. In addition to studying it scientifically, from the outside, as a historian of philosophy, in some sense as a scholar of religion, as a historian of education, I came to the church, I came to the temple. And it was then that the wonderful opportunities I am now happily sharing with all our valued listeners truly opened up to me.
To develop your spiritual side.
Yes, exactly.
Tell us, there's also this trend now where some people are giving Zoom sermons. I see a lot of different shorts and reels where young priests talk about their daily lives, showing that they are actually ordinary people, just young guys going to work, explaining what the sacrament of communion is, what prosphora are, how to write prayer notes, and all of it in very simple language. So what do you think, how relevant are modern technologies, media, and let's say preaching of such dogmas in this way? For example, things that I used to think you had to go to church to learn about, but now you can find them online. How relevant is this, and are you for or against it?
I'm for it. If it works, if it's done well, and by those who can speak about it from the inside, and a priest can and therefore should speak about it from the inside. If someone who has never taken communion is talking about communion, then I'm against it. Well, I mean, I'm not exactly against it, I just won't watch or listen to it. It's very valuable when priests show that, on the one hand, they are just like everyone else, like police officers, like doctors, like teachers. That's right. But on the other hand, there is a fundamentally and profoundly important difference between them and ordinary lay people. What exactly is it? They serve and possess the inherent right to bless us, to graciously bestow blessings upon us, and to meticulously perform the sacred Eucharist, a truly central and vital sacrament.
Now, there's also a trend toward artificial intelligence. What do you think about the interaction between AI and theology in the future, say in the near term, maybe a year from now, or even 50 years from now? In other words, if we take these two, let's say, seemingly polar worlds, is there any possible prospect for cooperation between them? Is it possible to somehow come up with an artificial intelligence that it will broadcast, help people there come to faith, or, well, to what extent is this such a mutually complementary story?
We've already come up with something. Already students of theological schools, and I am still a professor at the St. Petersburg Theological Academy.
Yeah.
For more than 15 years now, artificial intelligence has been consistently helping not only students across various educational levels, but also some young and dedicated priests who are increasingly utilizing these advanced AI services to effectively make their demanding work considerably easier and more efficient.
Wow.
Yes, so all of this is already working. Another matter is that if we think critically, and I mean critical thinking in the highest, deepest, and most serious sense of the word, when you are able not only to pause in your routine paperwork, whatever you are doing, but to stop and look at it from the outside.
Yeah.
And to go beyond, well, your own specific specialty, your chosen profession, your everyday mundane routine. That is truly critical thinking in the most serious and profound sense of the word, not just impulsively clicking on the very first line you happen to see, the initial link, in an attempt to quickly find an answer. Didn't like the answer? Click the second one. Oh, I like the second one. That's not critical thinking, right? Real critical thinking is when you actually turn off the computer and start thinking about what you're doing, and then maybe you pull out an old book with yellowed pages, read something, compare, reflect. And here with artificial intelligence, the danger is that it won't be framed by this kind of critical thinking from those who create and promote it. And then, as they say, it might end up devouring its own creators.
You know, this is already happening. It's called vibe coding. It's a kind of program where you just write what you want and it creates an app or a website for you. Basically, we're just one step away from that. But for now, it's still under control.
Well, the main thing is to make sure this coding doesn't end up writing what you want and then force you to do what it wants. And that's exactly why we need theology as a treasury of meanings, which allows us to stop, to put a stop to things, yes, to stop them.
Exactly. And I also think that theologians as professionals could be especially useful in the sense that when we eventually live in a world where everything is, so to speak, controlled by artificial intelligence, theologians will be needed as a fundamental resource to ensure that values and empathy are embedded into artificial intelligence. And it seems like this is exactly where theologians will play an important role. What do you think?
I think you're right. We must not forget about philosophy. We must not forget about philosophical ethics, but there are many philosophers and many approaches. Choosing one out of 700, 100, or even 10 that you like is, of course, an interesting task. But how do you get the rest of the millions, billions of people on Earth to use the same classification and choose what you chose? That's the question. We will always have discordant voices, and the main books of culture have already been written.
And if we smoothly move on to the question of values, what is considered a value for a person today?
As we understand, there are different kinds of values, right? Listening to good music, classical music in a large philharmonic hall, that's a value. Yes, I don't know. Petting a cat is a value. Spending time with your beloved family is a value.
Talking with a doctor of philosophy.
Oh, I wouldn't rule that out either. Yes, the money on our cards, in our accounts, that's also a value. You can't do without it. But if we talk about traditional values, about what we now understand as traditional Russian spiritual and moral values, then it's quite a specific list, a list of concepts which, of course, can be arranged hierarchically in different ways. By the way, His Holiness the Patriarch spoke about this, about the need to interpret, to understand more clearly, to sort out what patriotism is, what love for the motherland is, what humanism is, what collectivism is, what a strong family is. By the way, for this very purpose, St. Petersburg University has just prepared, at the government's request, a 2-volume explanatory dictionary of the state Russian language. This is so that there is a unified understanding in the fields of law and media regarding how to interpret a particular word. Yes, and from this dictionary also comes the understanding of which words are prohibited for public use. It also provides a clear definition of what constitutes obscene language. This work is also aimed at clarifying what values are, so that we have a clear understanding. And in general, it seems to me that among such key things, we often declare a year dedicated to something, and then we spend the whole year talking about what was declared. For example, there was the year of the mentor and teacher. Then there was the year of the strong family. Now it's the year of the defender of the fatherland, right? So it seems to me that the year of the strong family has ended. That's it. But this is probably the key issue right now. What is a family? How do we define it? Does a family include, say, a grandmother who lives with you, a second cousin who has always lived with you, and a single person, right? What is a complete family and what is an incomplete family? And in general, how should we regard a family? Can we treat it as a legal entity? For example, to whom should we issue, who should be registered as the owner of, say, the gazelle van that the governor gives to a large family? To the father?
To the wife.
To the wife or to the whole family? I think it's very important to consider this, especially given that, unfortunately, young people these days are in no hurry to formalize their love with marriage, and in the long run, that's quite a significant issue.
Listen, is church wedding a popular tradition now, or do you know anything about that? How much?
Do people get married in church? Well, I don't keep track, of course. So I'm always happy, really happy, when someone among my young friends or relatives not only signs the papers at the registry office, but also gets married in church. But that's also a responsibility. It increases it many times over.
And who is your favorite philosopher or theologian? Or both?
When it truly comes to discussing theologians, I would be exceedingly cautious about speaking in terms of absolute favorites or even least favorites. But of course, if I absolutely had to make a definitive choice, much like if you were to genuinely ask, what essential items would you ultimately take with you to a completely deserted island, far from civilization, I think I would probably take Blessed Augustine first of all. I would probably take Saint Basil the Great first of all. I might not even take into consideration Francisco Suarez, to whom I meticulously dedicated my very first candidate dissertation. That was a long time ago, back in the last century, at the end of the last century, because the scholastics write in a tedious and very lengthy, drawn-out way. That's it. But of course, you truly need to have the profound gospel readily at hand for all these significant texts to really come alive and resonate deeply. And philosophers like René Descartes and Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz are perhaps exemplary in a certain sense. They first moved away from theology towards philosophy. And in this freedom of philosophical thought and creativity, they returned, realizing that philosophy alone is not capable of providing answers to the fundamental questions. That is their value.
Well, I can't pass up the opportunity, since I'm talking to a doctor of philosophy, to ask you to help me look smarter, more attractive, and better than I really am on a date. Tell me, what is the main difference between Kant's pre-critical and post-critical periods?
That's an unexpected question. Kant, of course, is an interesting and pivotal figure. Such an astonishing character, standing at the crossroads of two eras, a kind of turning point. Before him there was dogmatism, but he came along and turned everything upside down. He actually belonged to the Pietist movement in Protestantism, which is quite specific, with a very personal, profound understanding of God. At some point, apparently, he decided that it was necessary, from the standpoint of reason, to justify everything so as not to depend on faith. And from this, what he considered a critical perspective, to look at everything that had come before.
Rationalism.
Well, yes, a kind of rationalism in which certain things in themselves or things for themselves are fundamentally unknowable by their very nature, turn out to have power over us and give us a certain impulse, yes, prompting us to seek knowledge and so on. But everything inside we determine ourselves. Our cognition is autonomous, independent. From what I would call a fairly materialistic, natural scientific, ordinary worldview, he shifted to a kind of philosophical idealism with which he tried to replace the role of theology in fact. And by the way, the topic of religion within the bounds of reason alone, the attempt to construct moral laws, not relying on theology, but rather formulating it precisely from a philosophical point of view as an inherent and fundamental need of human reason itself, right? Religion within the bounds of reason alone. All of this, it seems to me, does not provide an organic understanding of the world, does not build a systematic worldview, but on the contrary contributes to some kind of internal spiritual split.
And in which, do many universities have a faculty of theology?
Actually, there probably aren't any purely theological faculties. There are faculties where philosophy is combined with theology. Theology together with religious studies, departments of theology. In religious schools, in academies and seminaries, there is a department of theology. Well, that's the traditional name. The Institute of Theology, strictly speaking, is the only one of its kind at a university of this level here in St. Petersburg.
Wow. If you could ask God one question, what would you ask him?
I have no questions for him, only gratitude. Seriously, I really don't have any questions.